Um, I want to bring you greetings from my school. Used to be called the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. We are now called the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. We changed our name. This is a place which is doing a lot of things that some of you might be interested in. And if you are, you can find us very easily online just by doing carterschool.gmu.edu, and you'll find lots of activity, lots of people, lots of activities. I also, I wanted to mention that my most recent book, if you get interested in this, is called Resolving Structural Conflicts, and here's what it looks like: Resolving Structural Conflicts. And this is a book, I'll be talking a little bit about this as we go along, but this is a book about the kinds of conflicts that we keep running into that are being produced by some system that's generating conflict. So that the conflict's not just the result of people not understanding each other or people or not liking each other, but it's actually taking place because there's a system that's setting people at each other's throats. The most obvious example of that, by the way, is something like a prison, which is filled with people who are, for all sorts of reasons, hostile to each other. If you have a prison, you know you're going to have violence. And it's not just because the people are violent, it's because the system makes them more so. So we at our school, we're dealing with a whole range of conflicts of various kinds now, which more and more, I have to say, include conflicts that are taking place in the United States for reasons that you'll certainly understand why we've gotten very interested in that. But religious conflict is a particularly interesting and mysterious, in some ways, still mysterious subject. And so I wanted to talk to you about that. And then maybe at the end, we can talk about forms in which religious conflict is taking place in our own country. It's not just taking place in exotic places, you know what I mean? And I'll try to keep my remarks relatively short. I'll talk for maybe half an hour, that's all. And so we have plenty of time to talk to each other, because this subject is bothersome, and it creates always generates a lot of questions. And I've still got a lot of questions myself that I'm trying to work out. I'm still writing on the topic. In fact, I want to mention I'll plug one more book. We have an edited book now coming out. It'll be out about the 1st of March, produced by a British publisher. And it's called Conflict Resolution After the Pandemic. And a couple of the chapters in that book deal with religious conflicts too. The publisher is named Routledge, 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 and the book's called Conflict Resolution After the Pandemic. First thing I think I want to say about religious conflict is that nobody expected it. Nobody expected it to happen when it happened. Of course, it would not be the first time that academics like me missed the boat or didn't fail to predict things that were going to happen. Our record actually in predicting things is not that good. But just to refresh your memory a little bit about this, the general attitude about religion and conflict was, certainly when I was growing up, was that thank God it was becoming a thing of the past. That if you wanted to see examples of really terrible religious conflicts, you go back in history, go back quite far in history. You might want to go back and look at the Crusades or look at the religious wars in Europe. If you wanted to see religion as a factor of conflict, of course, you didn't have to go back that far. Just go back to Nazi Germany. and you'll see religion being quite horribly a factor in conflict. But the overall theory that was conditioning the training of people like me as I went through my schooling emphasized what was then called modernization. And the idea was that the whole world was becoming modern, which meant really Western. And as that happened, as modernization proceeded, the same things that seemed to have happened in the West would happen everywhere else. Well, what had happened to the West was that following the religious wars in Europe, there's an agreement generally understood, although there were some horrible exceptions to it, an agreement to separate church and state to a greater extent, agreement to allow a multiplicity of religions. It was called religious pluralism, an agreement to tolerate the beliefs of other people, even if you didn't share the beliefs yourself. And all of this connected with a kind of general movement in Western society towards two things: the privatization of religion and overall secularization, especially where public policy matters were concerned. So it's not that, clearly not that religion disappeared, but rather that it was more and more considered something that was essentially private, in the sense of being between a person and their God, or between a family and members of the community, and not a matter which should be allowed to dictate how people felt about public policy and how they acted in pursuit of one. And especially, it was not supposed to be used to prefer one religion over another. Of course, in the United States, we had the First Amendment against the establishment of religion. But even in other countries that didn't have any constitution, they all seemed to be going in the same direction. One, religion considered a more private matter. Two, a general tendency to try to deal with matters of public policy in terms of political principles that might have some historical relationship to religion, but were not being dictated by any particular religious belief or religious clergy. And this, many of you, I'm sure, will remember a kind of great turning point in a way in American history when Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy, was running for president and made his speech in West Virginia, in which the question was raised: would he, if he were president, would he behave? And to what extent would he behave as a Roman Catholic? And Kennedy said, basically, my being a Roman Catholic has something to do with my overall, attitude towards life and stuff, but it has nothing to do with what I'll do as president. And he specifically said, I won't take orders in any way, shape, or form from the Pope. So that reflected an understanding which people thought, many sociologists and historians and others thought, that this was going to become worldwide. And as it became worldwide, religion would become less and less of a cause of massive social conflict or violent social conflict. Didn't turn out that way. And I won't take the time to go through the whole history, but let me just say also, if you're interested in the history of religion and conflict and violent conflict, the best book around is Karen Armstrong's study called Fields of Blood. Karen Armstrong is a marvelous woman. I met her a couple of times now. She writes very well, and she has a complex view, which she explains very well, very clearly, of the relationship of religion to violence. We'll come back to that in a second. So what happened? Well, the first thing that happened, the first shock really, was that there was a revolution in Iran in the 80s, the late 70s, actually. The Iranian Revolution which pretty much everybody expected to produce some kind of a secular nationalist leader, maybe a leftist, maybe not. That I remember the debate, the discussions very well, because I was teaching college in Chicago at the time. There were a lot of Iranian students where I was teaching, and they were all, so what will the new regime look like? Nobody predicted that a religious leader named Khomeini, who was in exile in Paris and sending tapes, audio tapes, to his followers in Iran, would basically, that would set the country on fire. And that when the revolution occurred, the various secular forces, and there were lots of them, would be outnumbered, outflanked, right, outmaneuvered, and Iran would experience the first religious revolution since the British Revolution of the 1600s. So that came as an enormous shock. And after it happened, people said, well, that's because the Shia Muslims are so volatile, and so this and so that. In other words, it was attributed to the fact that they were Shia. But not very long after that happened, religion became a factor in conflict in lots of other places. In some places, it became, it was more of a label, actually, than a cause of conflict. In places like Northern Ireland, where Catholics and Protestants were fighting with each other, but they weren't fighting about religious matters. They were fighting about who had jobs and who didn't have jobs, and who had done what to whom centuries earlier. In that kind of case, we say religion is really functioning as a badge of ethnicity. It was really an ethnic conflict kind of dressed up as a religious conflict. But in other cases, for example, in Israel and Palestine, religion soon became a very important factor in a conflict that had not been particularly religious at all up to that point. You know, I'm sure you know the history of that area, and if you do, you'll know that the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians was for a long time led by parties on both sides that said they were socialist and secularist. And that were not particularly strongly influenced by religious factors.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I better talk fast, I think. All right, so what I was saying was that just about the time that people in the West were saying, well, these religious conflicts are really awful, but they're taking place in other countries, in foreign countries, and places outside the West. Just around that time, people became aware, sharply aware, that it wasn't just Muslims, it wasn't just Jews who had become strongly involved in religious politics. It was people in the West, especially Christians, who had mobilized various movements, particularly. So to continue with this, and let me get to the quickly to the point before we lose contact again. The questions that then get raised about religion and conflict are several. There are several key questions that I want to flag for you, and tell you a little bit about what some of the answers are, and then tell you a little bit about what kinds of conflict resolution are being proposed or used to deal with conflicts involving religion. First thing I want to say is I'm talking about conflicts involving religion instead of using the phrase religious conflict, because lots of these, I mentioned already the Northern Ireland conflict, which is really not about religious beliefs very much at all, but about social issues. And if you look at over the whole range of conflicts involving religion, you'll see that a number of them, but actually a very small number, involve disputes over specifically religious beliefs. Some of them involve disputes over beliefs, but beliefs that aren't so much associated with religion. You might call them general social values. Others don't involve disputes about belief at all, but involve disputes about things like how people are being treated economically or socially, or who's discriminating against whom, or that sort of thing. I'm old enough to remember when Catholics, Protestants, and Jews in the United States were constantly in conflict in places like New York, where I grew up, but not violent conflict, not particularly bitter conflict, bargainable conflicts that involve things like which day should the stores be open or stores be closed, blue laws conflicts, and other matters which were being constantly negotiated between representatives of the different faiths. So, and one of the questions that interests us very much now about conflicts involving religion is why so many of them are not particularly bargainable, why they seem to involve issues that are very difficult to resolve without violence or without some kind of severe break in people's relations. So we're talking about, you can think actually of conflicts involving religion as being spread over a spectrum in which on one side the conflicts really are about material things or political influence or other stuff, not especially religious. And on the other side, as I said before, a kind of small number of conflicts that are very religious. For example, one of my books is called When Jesus Became God. And I wrote it about 20 years ago, and it's still selling. And it's about controversies in the early Christian church about whether Jesus was divine or not. Those were theological controversies. But even in those cases, one of the things I discovered in doing this research was that it's very rare to have a disagreement, even about theological matters, that doesn't involve other kinds of conflict as well. And part of the real problem of religious conflict and dealing with religion and conflict is that religion can become a kind of magnifying glass or, a catalyst, a piece of the conflict capable of inflaming people, but actually which is taking place in a conflict that involves many other issues other than religious issues. And certainly when we think of conflicts even now in places like the United States, and we ask why are right-wing evangelical Christians, for example, so upset about any number of issues and willing to fight them by use all sorts of methods against people that they consider their enemies, even there you find out that it's not simply a matter of we think the Bible says this and somebody else thinks the Bible says that, but it also has to do with issues like the state of the community that people are coming from, like feelings that they have that they're being exploited or badly treated in job terms, in economic terms, or feelings that they're being discriminated against in political terms, or feelings that their status, which was based on being white Christians who had all the power at a certain time, and now the power seems to be shrinking for various reasons. So religion and conflict, we talk about religion and conflict, not just religious conflicts, okay? That being said, the question still is, why have these conflicts become so intense in our time? And why have they become so intense on a global level? This is not a kind of conflict that's limited to one region or one situation even. or another. There are a number of theories making the rounds trying to explain this. I'll mention just a couple of them. And you can think about what your own views might be about why there has been such a strong and kind of global increase in religious conflict. One way of looking at this conflict, especially the conflicts involving people outside the West, has to do with the relationship of the West to places outside the West. And for example, the fact that if you look at the Middle East or Central Asia or lots of other regions around the world, you have a history in which the better developed, the better industrially developed, and more militarily powerful and more politically active world leaders have been in a position to dominate others. Some people call it empire building or imperialism. There are other ways of looking at it, other names for it. But as soon as you start talking to people, for example, who are adhering to Islamist movements in the Middle East, and I've had occasion to talk to a number of them, you find out that one of the kind of major factors in that conflict is a deep-seated resentment of being dominated by people outside their region, being told what to do for generations and generations by people outside the region, and a feeling that they've lost control of their own culture, and they've lost control of their own ability to make decisions about how they want to live. And many of them dream of the good old days, as some of them see it, when there were great Muslim empires, and when they were calling the shots for their own people. Other folks have pointed out, looking at all this, that religion, in this sense, only became a really important factor in conflicts in the Middle East and in West Asia when other forms of political opposition, nationalist, socialist, and so forth, were defeated. And they were defeated in partly by the West and partly by local forces. Sometimes it seems that religion is the only game in town, and that if you want to unite a people in support of, to defend their own cultural traditions or to defend their political independence, you basically resort to a kind of Maccabean solution. You know, the first important instance that we know of in written history, where there was a movement that began as terrorist and ended up with a war of national liberation to defend the religion and culture of the people from a great empire that was trying to dominate them, was the Maccabees, getting rid of the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, in the second century before the Common Era. So that we see that pattern repeating again. That's one. So there's one set of theories that has to do, that says look at power relations between countries and also between groups within countries, and you'll see people sometimes using religion to try to unify their people and oppose power that they feel is oppressive power against them. Okay, that's one possibility. But then I have just said to begin with that this is not just a matter that's happening outside the West, it's happening inside the West, especially in countries like the U.S. That is to say that it's not terribly violent yet, and I hope it won't become violent, but there's a growth and intensity of religious-related conflict in our country as well. Well, in explaining that, some people have said religion is resorted to by people as a political stance as well as a religious stance. People, in other words, start to see their religion as being politically salient and start to use it for political purposes when basic needs that they have are not being fulfilled by the existing secular system. I'll give you an example of this from outside the country, the most glaring example I know of. In Algeria, after the Algerians had their revolution and broke away from France, which took place in the 50s and 60s, there was a long period in which there was a new government in Algeria, which was mainly moderate. It was moderate Islamist, really more secular than anything else. And the government was corrupt. And the government didn't protect the interests of the people. The government didn't deal with the fact that, the oil industry in Algeria was still totally dominated by the French, and there were other issues. And also people were unhappy. People who were religious people were unhappy that their interests didn't seem to be considered as strongly as they ought to. And the result was that the religious party in Algeria got so strong that they were on the verge of winning the election there of 1992. The government called the election off, and the next, there was the worst outbreak of internal religious terrorism in Algeria that anybody had ever seen. There were tens of thousands of people killed by extremist religious groups in Algeria. Well, as I say, thank goodness that hasn't happened here or in any other Western country yet. But people have been pointing out that there are lots of folks who are feeling unsatisfied, needs that they have that are unsatisfied, either because they feel themselves members of communities and cultures that are not doing well, that seem to be endangered, that are sometimes looked down on and despised even. Take rural people in the United States when we call them hillbillies or white trash or, that sort of thing. People who have humiliated and see religion as a way to restore pride and power. One of my colleagues, Dan Rothbard, has just written a book on humiliation as a factor in the development of various kinds of violent social movements, including religious movements. Other people are feeling that the kind of secular society that has evolved in countries like the United States is so concerned with materialism and getting ahead, is so competitive, and is so spiritually dry that they have a powerful longing for religious, sources of inspiration and sources of support. And when you combine that kind of powerful longing with feelings of being socially or politically abused, that's dynamite. Then you get the possibility for a militant movement to march under the banners of religion, even though many of the issues that they're complaining about or the changes that they want to make aren't particularly religious. There's a third theory, too. I want to mention it quickly and stop with this listing of theories, in which you'll hear people say, well, the problem with conflicts involving religion is that where religious matters are concerned, people are absolutely concerned that they are right. They believe what they believe because of faith. You can't argue with them. You can't argue them out of it. And conflict resolution is very difficult under those circumstances. People are not willing to compromise, and they're willing to take that step, where you say, I might be wrong, or I might have to rethink my position. It's one of my best friends at my school, a colleague who's since retired, used to have a banner hanging from the ceiling in his office that said, I might be wrong. And the idea that sort of consciousness, I might be wrong, is one of the ways in which you get to resolve conflict. That's maybe hard to apply when it comes to matters of religious belief, religious faith. On the other hand, history is full of examples of religious conflicts which did get resolved after a while, even though there were strong belief factors like this involved, and people for a while at least, behaved as if they would never listen to anybody else. They were very dogmatic and very intense about their beliefs. So really the last thing I wanted to say, and I'm going to make this quick and then open the door for conversation, is what if you have a conflict involving religion and you're trying to resolve it, and you're coming face to face with the fact that many people are in the position of the person I saw. I was driving the car before all of this COVID stuff started, and somebody had a car with a bumper sticker right in front of me, and the bumper sticker said, "The Bible says it. The Bible is the Word of God. End of argument." Right? And so if you run up against this kind of mentality, what are you going to do? Well, there are a couple of examples that are worth considering, and a couple of principles that I think are worth considering in trying to resolve this sort of conflict. One is that when people have strongly held beliefs, and those beliefs are playing an important role in their conflict posture, you don't argue them out of those beliefs. You don't talk them out of it, and you don't get them to stop having beliefs by telling them those beliefs are stupid or those beliefs are crazy, because that simply doesn't work. So one thing you do if you're trying to resolve conflicts in that kind of situation is you work around those beliefs. And I'll give you one example that's one of my favorites of this. One of my former students is a nun named Adrienne Kaufman, who's currently a teacher in a college now in the Midwest. Adrienne and another Catholic friend of hers, a laywoman, set up dialogue workshops on the subject of abortion, right to life, right to choose, in 2 cities in which there have been abortion doctors shot by anti-abortion forces, Pensacola, Florida, and Buffalo, New York. And what they decided to do in these workshops was not to have people who were pro-choice or pro-life arguing with each other about who was right, because they felt that was a no-win situation. Neither side was going to give up, and also if people thought that they were there that day, the facilitators were there to change people's beliefs, people would just walk out. They wouldn't listen. So they decided instead that the most important thing to do would be to have people on both sides, and the people they were working with were leaders of the pro-choice and pro-life movements, not just people in the street. They thought the most important thing to do was to have these folks tell their stories, that is, to talk about why they had come to believe so strongly in what they believed, and where they thought the conflict was headed. But just in the storytelling, just in getting to appreciate why people who think differently than you do think differently than you do, without trying to convince you to change your own beliefs, the result was that they humanized each side to the other. That the pro-choice people, for example, decided, oh, these pro-life people aren't just robots, doing what they're doing because the Pope told them to, or somebody, the local priest told them to. They actually, some of them at least, actually are pro-life, and they're even against the death penalty, and they're thoughtful people. And the pro-life people looked at the pro-choice people, heard their stories, and thought, oh, we thought that some women were using abortion as a convenient method of birth control, etc. And now we find out that the women who have had to have abortions don't think it was any fun, and we're perfectly aware of the fact that that was potential adult life in their wombs.
So that beyond the theological argument, this became a kind of the human circumstances of people making choices became more important for each side. And the result was, in Buffalo, that when this workshop was over, even though nobody changed their views about abortion, representatives of the two sides decided that they could work together on doing something they did agree on, which was to change, to reform the adoption system in Buffalo. That if people wanted to adopt babies and babies needed to be adopted, there ought to be a way of doing that. And the Buffalo system was no good at that point. And they worked together and changed it. So it didn't eliminate the religious conflict, but it eliminated the kind of the vicious consequences of the conflict, the violent side of the conflict. And one way you deal with religious conflict, it seems to me, is that you don't try to change people's religious beliefs. You do try to get them to express themselves and to relate to other people in a nonviolent, and maybe even a socially constructive way. In this case, it was a socially constructive way. So the other thing I want to mention is that when you're analyzing a religious conflict and when you get to talk to people who are involved in a conflict involving religion, you do find out about all sorts of non-religious reasons that have got them upset, and that have got sometimes thinking mythological thoughts, longing for a return to some golden age. For example, and kind of sort of identifying the good old time of religion with the vanished golden age. And then say, I'll give you, this is a true example. I'm talking to people who are quite far to the right religiously and are hostile to a lot of government programs in particular. I'm trying to find out, well, what's bothering you? After a while, it turns out one of the things that's bothering them, and I think this, by the way, is very common, is that family relations in their community are messed up. I mean, family relations in most American communities are messed up, as I'm sure you know. The divorce rate is passing 50%. Parents everywhere are talking about their children not listening to them, etc. In some particularly more impoverished rural communities, like the one that I was dealing with in this particular instance, you also had on top of that a terrible drug addiction problem that was further screwing up people's family lives. So after a certain amount of talk, I found that it wasn't that difficult to turn people's attention to, well, what are we going to do about the causes of the community problems that are causing families to break up? Some of them had tried to answer and to solve that problem by saying the problem is people don't believe in the good old religion anymore, and therefore that's why the parents, the wives won't listen to the husbands, the children won't listen to the parents. We need to go back to some kind of more authoritarian social relations where men tell women what to do and parents tell children what to do. And at that point, I could say, well, maybe you're right about that, maybe you're wrong. I don't even want to, I don't want to talk about it. I do want to talk about things that need to be done when you have a child that's drug addicted. You've got a community here with no mental health facilities. You've got a community here with no drug counselors. You've got a community here with nobody for you to talk to, unless your pastor is particularly sensitive on some of these issues. There's nobody to talk to if you and your wife aren't getting along. And there are social services to deal with these issues, and they cost money, and they are government programs, but you're going to have to think a little bit differently about government programs, I'm afraid, especially if you get to control them. Then the question becomes, so you want more government programs, you need them, but you don't want the government to tell you what to do, then what kinds of institutions do you need to permit community control of these programs? Well, as soon as you start talking like that, I find that people are listening. And people are willing to talk that way. People are willing to stop saying it's all, the good religion versus the bad religion. So part of the answer, I think, is getting at the sources of oppression and anxiety that are causing people to take extremist religious positions sometimes, which can be dealt with by changing the way we deal with them, by changing the system, if you like, the public policy system that we've got. So that's the whole message I was trying to deliver. And sorry, it took so long with so much interference. We're now at my school, as you can imagine, very interested in doing this sort of thing and trying to work with people who have differences of belief that maybe can be dealt with by using some of these techniques. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to talk further, listen to you, whatever.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Wow, so much to unpack and very thoughtful.